Good morning. When I came back from Victor Charles' house from an Encino to El Cajon, California, and my mother was going into surgery on her lower spine. A short while after her surgery, my father told my two sisters and me, and he said, "Your mother is dying. We need to go and say goodbye to your mother." I was stunned, and soon, and the doctor said she would live. But after she came back to our home, my father and mother broke their marriage forever. During the next 2 years, dramatic changes would last for a lifetime. Victor Charles would be spending his last year or so living his Encino house in San Fernando Valley. I returned to El Cajon with the hope that my father and mother had resolved their marriage problems, but underneath there was a fissure waiting to dissolve our family. I went to El Cajon Junior High School, and I felt like a fish out of water. When I was living with my Uncle Victor Charles, I was growing in a positive direction, but after returning, I was completely stalemated and bored. My family soon met a tragic fate when my mother Hilda was in Grossmont Hospital in La Mesa, California, for surgery on her lower spine. A short while after her surgery, my father Sonny told my two sisters and me, saying, "Your mother is dying. We need to go and say goodbye to your mother." I was numb and emotionally frozen. I felt nothing. It was so surreal. My mother had an 8-inch length and 3-inch width deep surgical opening on the lower portion of her back. She was dying from staph infection. The doctors gave her no hope of surviving. What we learned much later, when my father, knowing she was dying, he must have felt guilty, and so he confessed to her that he recently had an affair with another woman. At that point in time, he believed she would soon die, and no one else would ever know what he said except for her. Why he chose to tell her is anyone's guess, but in doing so, it would lead to a divorce in March of 1967. My mother miraculously survived and spent 4 months in Grossmont Hospital and another month in recovery at her parents' home. When she returned to our home, my father was then living elsewhere. Throughout those darkened days, when we were sleeping, I would hear my mother crying in her empty bed every night. I was angry and confused because my whole world had been turned upside down. I wished all the more to be living in Encino once again with my Buono family, but unfortunately, that was not to be for me. I eventually went to live with my father, Sonny, on Washington Avenue in El Cajon, California, and I was attending El Cajon High School in the 9th grade. Our family was completely fractured during 1966. All my hopes and dreams when we were a united family were now gone forever, and there was only black horizons and the unknown for me to see. In January of 1966, Victor Charles was playing in the role of Colonel Hubris in the television program The Man from U.N.C.L.E., titled The Deadly Goddess Affair, starring Robert Vaughn and David McCallum. It was released on January 16, 1966, and the executive producer was Norman Felton. The one major element missing with Victor Charles when entering into 1966 was him not being in the company of legendary Betty Davis, Joan Crawford, Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Bing Crosby, and many others that he acted with before. His performance in Dean Martin's The Silencers, playing in the role of Tung Tease, was released on February 18, 1966, and it was the beginning of Victor Charles's drought of not being cast in quality motion pictures any longer. During that time, he soon would lose his Encino house. He did perform in another Perry Mason television program titled The Case of the Twice-Told Twist, playing in the role of Ben Huggins. It was released on February 27, 1966, and the executive producer was Gail Patrick Jackson. The character he played was the leader of a gang who stole cars for a living. I've always found it to be ironic that my Uncle Victor Charles was given so many gangster and villainous roles in television and motion pictures, when he most likely had captured the characteristics of the real mafia men who knew when he was a young boy in San Diego. He was taught to be an actor within classic Shakespearean productions and classic American plays at the Oak Globe Theater, but Hollywood producers and casting directors only saw him acting in the world of violence, thievery, and death that his father once had lived before. Why didn't Hollywood cast Victor Charles in a sensitive role, like being a college professor teaching young students about the classic years of history? Why didn't Hollywood cast him as a Catholic priest in the slums of New York City in the 1950s, reaching out to violent young men who were killing one another? Why couldn't my Uncle Victor Charles be seen as a generous and loving man when being an actor in Hollywood? There were numerous motion pictures that were written by screenwriters with noble storylines filled with meaningfulness and dignity. Instead of making Victor Charles look like a hero and kind person, they chose to turn him into a monster that robbed, pillaged, and would kill as many people as he could. Hollywood placed Victor Charles mostly in three categories: buffoonery, horror pictures, and nonsensical B-graded motion pictures. He was better than that, but Hollywood didn't allow him the dignity he deserved as being a trained classic Shakespearean actor who had a brilliant mind and a golden tongue when speaking amusing and meaningful words. What it came down to was about money. Money to make a living in Hollywood. Money to remain active as an actor in television and motion pictures, and money to pay his monthly bills and mortgage. Hollywood didn't believe he could play a role as a loving husband or a father guiding his children through life. Hollywood denied his sensitivity, and they replaced it only with fright for his gore-loving audiences. For the need of money and fame, Victor Charles had to surrender his dignity, because Hollywood wouldn't allow a 6'3" 350-pound young man to become a hero. The hero roles, apparently, were only reserved for slim and handsome men in those days. My Uncle Tony once told me when Victor Charles was acting as King Tut in 1966 to 1967 in the Batman series, he came home growling, "They're turning me into a whore." And the television program Batman was titled The Curse of Tut, starring Adman West as Batman and Burt Ward as Robin, and it was released on April 13, 1966. On the next day, on April 14, 1966, Victor Charles performed in Batman titled The Pharaoh's in a Rut. On April 22, 1966, Victor Charles was looking for a place to film his new and original motion picture, The Reluctant Vampire, written by Bob Gary. And in a Jeanne Miller article, he said, "I just bought the script and I would like to direct the film myself and playing only a cameo role. I've directed at the Old Globe Theater in San Diego, where I got my start, but I'm anxious to try my hand at filmmaking. In fact, I've bought a complete 16mm setup and I've made quite a number of 10 and 15-minute films which have helped me to a better understanding of my work as an actor, as well as providing valuable experience and insight for directing. I was reared in a Catholic school, St. Augustine, and from my earliest years I wanted to become a priest or doctor. When I was 18, I worked one summer at the Globe, and I was given the title role in Buono. I was hooked from then on. I decided that the chief reason the priesthood appealed to me was the wardrobe, and my ambitions as a doctor were limited to that great scene when I would emerge from the operating room, pulling off the gloves and shaking hands with the grateful father whose son's life I had just saved. I'm glad I realized in time what my real calling is. Even though my start was in the theater, I find myself more and more captivated by films and television. Both seem to be more challenging for this reason. In theater, you must liquefy your own personality and pour it into the skin of another character. But in films, you only liquefy part of it. You must leave large lumps of yourself sticking out. And I have plenty of advantage in that department. That's because films want an image, not a characterization, and therein lays the challenge. Besides, I don't know whether it's my Catholic upbringing or what, but I deplore the state of the theater today. I feel that plays like Virginia Woolf and The Toilet degrade the human spirit. I prefer to think my objections are not religious, but purely a matter of taste. Certainly, there is truth in these plays. It's also true that children soil diapers. But I wouldn't want to see that sort of display on stage. Serious filmmakers are really not guilty of these lapses in taste and selectivity. That brings us to the question of censorship. Yes, I feel it's necessary, and yes, I think it's bad. I know that's a contradiction, but it's my honest opinion. It would take a wiser man than I to figure out how it could be arranged without entirely violating freedom of artistic expression. But just as cigarette packages must warn that smoking is a health hazard, I feel that young minds and impressionable older minds should be warned of the danger of lewd and salacious theater and films. I play a dual role of two zany twin brothers. As far as movies are concerned, I'm waiting for my own Marty, or Henry VIII, or The Lodger. When such a role comes along, I will have arrived.